This video is going to cover investment demand. Investment demand is just the relationship between the real interest rate and the amount of investment in the economy. And investment is sensitive to the interest rate because a lot of investors borrow, and that's one of the things we're going to discuss in just a minute. But more importantly, before we get into all the nuts and bolts of this, why is it important that we study investment demand, and why do we need to know about this? And the main thing is that investment plays a huge impact on GDP. So investment makes up roughly 15 to 20% of GDP, but it accounts for about 2/3 of the change in GDP. So what we know is that when investment changes a little, that's going to have a larger impact on GDP. Now, the reason it has such a big impact, and maybe a larger impact even than consumption, is because although consumption does fluctuate, it doesn't fluctuate quite as wildly during various economic changes, because a lot of the spending that that consumers are engaged in is necessary spending. So they don't necessarily cut back or stop eating just because it's it's rough times. We do see fluctuations in consumption, but the reason that we see more in investment is because it's more sensitive to economic conditions. So if investment has such a big change in GDP and it's connected to the interest rate, we want to study the relationship between interest rates and investment so we can have a better sense of what's going on in the economy. Now, why is investment connected to the interest rate? As I've already said, the reason that the connection is because most businesses are borrowing money. And I'd like to ask the question, or propose the question, is why businesses borrow? And the example is pretty simple. Most people, first of all, go into business because they don't have lots of money. They're going into business to earn. And although this is not the technical answer to the question, it should just give you the logic that by and large, businesses need to borrow in order to make ideas happen. So they may have a great idea for a product or a service or something along those lines, but if they don't have the resources to make it come to fruition, the idea doesn't really do them any good. So a lot of businesses operate on a principle of leverage. And what that means is they kind of do the cost benefits analysis and say, if I can make enough money on this investment that I could still pay for the cost of borrowing the money to make the investment happen and still have a little bit left over for profit, that sounds like a pretty good idea. So as it turns out, most businesses that you encounter in your daily life are in debt. They have borrowed money to fund their operation. But it's not a bad idea necessarily. It's not the same thing as credit card debt. For example, if you can get a return on investment of all the money that you invest in a given market, let's say you could get a return of 10%. So I put in, $1,000, I'd walk away with $1,100 at the end of the year. And you could go ahead and borrow that money. The cost of funds would be, say, only 7%, then the difference of 3% is basically profit for the business. So most businesses are willing to take the 7% hit to get some profit rather than nothing. So here's a simple example. You have a project that would earn $1 million. Here are your choices. You can either pay no interest, we'll call this interest, pay zero interest, as in you don't borrow any money, and your profit then on that project is going to be zero, because you can't do it if you don't borrow the money. On the other hand, you could say pay $500,000 in interest and still end up with $500,000 profit. Again, it sucks to have to split the money with the bank, but it's better than not making anything. So as a result, we find that most businesses have borrowed money, and that's how they operate. They leverage a little bit of money that they've borrowed from the bank against the market, and they manage to make their living off the difference between how much they're paying out in interest and how much they're bringing in on sales and revenue. Let's take a look at some graphs for investment demand. We start off with our axes. We are going to have our quantity of investment and the price of investment, which you could write out, would also just be the real interest rate. And then we have a downward sloping demand curve. And so as you can see, when the interest rate is higher, the quantity of investment is a little bit lower, and as the interest rate falls, the quantity of investment goes up. So that's just a general downward sloping relationship as we've seen in the past. So the question we're going to ask ourselves then now is, how does this affect the business in terms of investing in the economy and so on? when we see, for example, a change in interest rates, let's suppose that interest rates had fallen. So we start off with an interest rate up here. Interest rate falls to this level. And what we will see is that the quantity of investment will go from quantity 1 up to quantity 2. Okay, well, why did that happen? But just remember that the interest rate is a cost for the business. So when the rate goes down, if rates fall, then costs fall. So you can imagine a project that you thought was going to benefit you, say $1,000, but it was going to cost you $1,100, including the interest, in order to do it. So if the revenue is $1,000, but the cost is $1,100, you would look at this as a business owner and say, I don't think this is a decision that I want to make or go forward with. Now, if you woke up the next morning and found out interest rates had fallen, and now the revenue for this project, which is still expected to be $1,000, but you find out that the cost has changed, that because of the lower interest rate, now maybe this project only costs you $900. Now, it's a choice of borrowing and then ending up with a total cost of $900 to get $1,000 make sense? Well, yes, because there's some profit involved. So as a result, when the interest rate falls, the amount of investment in the economy increases. Similarly, we can see situations occur where businesses wish to invest more regardless of the interest rate. So let's imagine a scenario where the interest rate had remained completely unchanged. So we'll just redraw the graph up here. Our rate, quantity, and our investment demand. So we'll just say that the rate today is 8%. But something happens that makes businesses much more optimistic about the future than they used to be. So there's a new invention, or maybe the end of a war, or some kind of like presidential election or political change, but something happens that makes businesses feel like, you know what, things are looking up. This is a great time to invest in the United States. They might start projecting that they have higher profits than normal, right? So as they start thinking, profits are going to rise, or I expect the profit on this project where it used to be, say, only $1,000. Now I expect my profit on this project to be more like $2,000. Well, even at an interest rate of 8%, it might still work. So what would happen in this case, if businesses became more optimistic, you would see an increase in the demand for investment, and then you would see that represented here by an increase in the quantity of investment. So here would be where we were before, and then after the increase in investment demand, there would obviously be a higher quantity of investment in the economy. So it's basically just a matter of looking at how interest rates affects businesses. Since interest rates are the price that businesses pay to borrow, and most businesses are in debt, when the interest rate changes, it has a fundamental impact on the cost of projects for businesses. So their expected profits would increase as a result of them realizing that they have lower costs through interest rates. So as interest rates fall, there's more investment. As interest rates rise, there's less investment.